Alright guys, let's check out the Glycine Combat Sub Aquarius. So this is Glycine's dedicated diver, and you do get a few advantages with that when you compare it to the standard Combat Sub. So the Aquarius does have a higher water resistance rating. This watch is rated to 50 atmospheres or 500 meters of water resistance, and the standard Combat Sub is rated to 20 atmospheres or 200 meters of water resistance. The Aquarius does come equipped with a helium escape valve at 8 o'clock, and this watch is ISO certified for saturation diving. It also comes with a dive extension built into the clasp, and this is not only convenient in day-to-day use, but it's also practical in a marine environment because you don't have to remove the watch from your wrist to get that extra adjustment, so you're less likely to drop it. Let's get into some of the specs. So we do have a case diameter of 46 millimeters. We have a case thickness of 16.7, and I measured that from the very center of the case back to the top of the single dome sapphire crystal. That is quite chunky, but that thickness is there to accommodate that extra water resistance. We do have a lug-to-lug distance of 54 millimeters. And I know that's quite broad, but these lugs do turn down really well. I have touched on this in another video I made about the Glycine Airman, but when you have lugs that curve down so well, you can't treat them like a linear measurement across the wrist. And I'll try to illustrate the difference between straight lugs and curved lugs. So I have another large watch here. It's my Baby Tuna. It has a similar case diameter. So if we take a pin or anything else that's straight and we put it at the lowest point of the lugs, right across the bottom, you can see that the center of the case back actually touches the pin there. So the lowest point of the lugs and the center of the case back are all on the same plane. So we're going to treat this like a linear measurement across the wrist. But when you do that with the Combat Sub or many other watches that have curved down lugs and you put a pin on the lowest point of the lugs, you can see just how high up the center of the case back is from the lowest point of the lugs. So we're going to treat this like a curved measurement. And so we can plug that into the equation to find circumference. That way we can get a good gauge on what the smallest size wrist that this watch could still be worn on. So we're going to take that 54 and slice it in half to get our radius of 27. And then we plug that into C equals 2 times pi times r. And that gives us a circumference of 169.56 millimeters. And we're just going to round that up to 170 millimeters. And to convert that from millimeters back into inches, we divide that 170 by 25.4. And we get a final circumference of 6.69 inches. And just to be on the safe side, we're going to round that up to 7 inches even. So I can comfortably say that this watch would fit on a 7-inch wrist. And I know on paper the specs don't really indicate that this watch would wear so well. But this watch is a prime example of, the specs on paper not always meeting, how a watch wears in reality. So I even thought when I first got this watch that it would be top heavy, it's thick and chunky. It doesn't come on a bracelet to balance out that weight on the head of the watch. So I thought it might bob around on my wrist and be really cumbersome. But this watch wears so well. I mean, it wears better than it has any right to on wrist. Check it out here. Here it is on wrist with the dive extension fully deployed, and I'm shaking my arm around, and this thing just stays planted. I mean, it sits so planted, it may as well have roots. So this thing just wears so comfortably. This is with about an extra inch of space on the strap here, and you can see it just still hugs the wrist so well. I have other watches that are much smaller, and if I tried to do this same thing with them, they would flop completely around my whole wrist if I were to wear them this loose on the bracelet or strap. So Again, this watch just wears better than it has any right to, and there's a few reasons for that, and we'll get into those. So, one of the biggest reasons why this watch wears so well is because it has a very broad and flat case back. So you can see the case back comes out to almost the entire diameter of the watch. So this case back provides a lot of surface area for the watch to sit on, and it allows it to distribute its weight evenly on the wrist. And that's one of the biggest reasons why it wears so well. So while we're talking about the case back, you can see that it's got some nice design here, nice imagery, and this ties into the name of the watch. So when I googled Aquarius, that means bringer of water, and in Greek mythology, that was this guy. So regardless how you feel about that kind of thing, this is still a nice case back to look at nonetheless. It's got some deep etching in there, but it's really comfortable, and that textured portion is really smooth. It's kind of got like an orange peel finish to it. And this case back's nice to look at nonetheless. So, one of my favorite things about this watch, while we're back here, is actually these four screws that you can see on the left and the right side that are just outboard of the case back here. And these four screws are actually used to remove the bezel. So the bezel is a full ceramic bezel. And if you were to try to pop this off Seiko style, you'd crack or shatter the ceramic. So Glycine developed this bezel removal system. That way you could evenly distribute pressure on the bezel to remove it without cracking it. So the way this would work is you'd kind of stagger these as you were tightening them to put pressure on the bezel. The same way you would put on a tire or remove a tire, you'd go in like a crisscross pattern. That way you can apply even pressure, and again, that way you don't crack that ceramic bezel insert. These screws are captured in here, and that just means that if you turn them counterclockwise, they won't ever fall out of the case. They're captured in there, so they won't ever become so loose that they fall out or anything. So I just think that this is a really genius design here. I'm happy that Glycine took the time to develop a bezel removal system for the ceramic bezel. Um, I just appreciate when something's designed with serviceability in mind, not as only somebody that works on watches and mods watches all the time, but somebody who also works on cars and stuff. This kind of actually reminds me of some drum brakes. So, some drum brakes have two little screw holes here that you can thread a bolt through, and that'll press on the wheel hub and help you remove the drum. Other drum brakes don't have these, and you just have to beat them with a rubber mallet until the drum comes loose, and you have to knock a bunch of rust loose and stuff like that. So if you ever done drum brakes, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And clearly the one with threaded bolt holes is the better system. So just as somebody who's always working on cars, I do timing belts and water pumps and just regular service stuff like brakes, but I also do head gaskets and more you know intense stuff like clutches and stuff like that. So um I appreciate when something's designed to be worked on. So that's my little spiel about that. But not only that, I have removed this bezel, and you can see that there is a rubber O-ring here on this metal portion of the bezel, and that is to act as a shock dampener so that the ceramic doesn't come in any unnecessary force with the hard steel parts of the bezel. So Glycine clearly thought this, full ceramic bezel out pretty well. I'm sure when they designed this, it came with its full set of own unique challenges, but they definitely did it the right way here. And I'm happy to say that they didn't just, slap a full ceramic bezel on there and not have an afterthought. This bezel system is really well designed and really well thought out. So while we're talking about the bezel, let's go ahead and get into some of it. So we have a fully matte base finish on the bezel, and we have polished relief minute markers, kind of a yacht master style. And even though the entire bezel is one color, you still get a decent amount of contrast, and the bezel is still really legible. You also have a nice sapphire um, covered loom pip at 12 o'clock, and I appreciate that as well. I love when Seiko puts a piece of Hardlex over their loom pip, so I'm happy to see a piece of sapphire used here on this full ceramic bezel as well. This bezel is a 60 click bezel, same as other combat subs, but this one does use a leaf spring instead of the standard combat sub has kind of like two little dimples welded into the case. So this one kind of uses a click spring the same way like Seiko bezel would, and that makes it turn a little more smoother. It's not as notchy. Still notchy like a normal 60 click bezel, but it is less notchy than the standard combat sub. And again, I do believe that's a design choice. That way, the ceramic isn't getting any extra unnecessary vibration or anything like that. So let's go ahead and sample the bezel action here. And you can hear it's still notchy like a standard 60 click, but it does turn smoother than a standard combat sub. Um, so it's got good bezel action. It lines up great. I do enjoy 60 click. I enjoy 120 click as well, but there's something about a 60 click that is satisfying as well. So let's go ahead and get into some of the dial details. So we have a matte charcoal dial. This is a fully printed dial. There's no applied indices or anything like that. We do have a matching date wheel done in black with white contrast. We have pencil style hour hand and minute hand, and we have that classic paddle seconds hand that all combat subs have. Um, Over top of that, we have a single dome sapphire crystal with 3 layers of green anti-reflective coating on the underside. And that single dome is going to give you some nice distortions from oblique angles. But underwater, that's kind of going to act more like a magnifying glass. So that's kind of appropriate for this being a dive watch. I was also curious to know why they used green anti-reflective coating instead of blue or something like that. So I looked up this chart, and this shows how different colors of light penetrate the different water columns. And so I thought maybe green would go the furthest down. Green still is the second most visible light at depth, but blue is still the one that goes down the furthest. So I'm not sure why they didn't use blue instead of green, but nevertheless, I do think it looks good and it makes this watch a little more unique. So let's go ahead and talk about the crown. So this has one of the most overbuilt crown and tomb systems that I've ever seen, and the standard combat sub has that as well. But the unique thing about the combat sub Aquarius is that if you look at the crown tube here, I took it all apart so you could see it. Um, if you look inside, there's hexagonal pattern, so you could use an Allen key. So this crown tube is actually replaceable and removable. It's a threaded crown tube. And if you weren't aware, most crown tubes are just press fitted. And that's common on a lot of watches. Even most dive watches have that. So I'm really happy to see that this is a replaceable and threaded crown tube. That's a really unique thing there. And the only other watches that I know that have a removable crown tube like that are really expensive and they are the Rolex Submariner. And if you look at its crown tube, it has more like a Torx style bit that would fit in there, so you could remove it. And also, I was watching an escapement and watch video about the new Seiko LX diver with the ever brilliant steel, and he mentioned in there that that had a replaceable crown tube. So the Glycine Combat Sub Aquarius is in good company with those other watches. This one's much less expensive, so I'm really happy to see a system like that being used in this watch. And again, it kind of goes back to that whole serviceability aspect, and this watch was clearly designed to have those features in it. But that's not all with the whole crown tube assembly and everything like that. If you look closely at the crown tube there, you'll see there's a visible gasket, but also on the crown stem, there's two more gaskets. And on the crown itself, there's a gasket that will seal up against the face of the crown tube. So there are a total of 4 gaskets in here, and that's definitely going to lock in that 500 meters of water resistance. Aside from that, when you unscrew the crown, and it has the first pop, but when you screw it clockwise, it has a secondary pop. And that's really kind of unique to the Combat Sub. I have other watches with the Sellita SW200. That's the movement inside this watch. We will talk about that in just a little bit. But again, I'll do that for you guys one more time. So when you unscrew the crown and then you screw it clockwise, there's a secondary pop before it will get into the winding position. And that's really cool because when you screw in the crown, you're not winding the movement. There's no sound there when you screw in the crown. Check any of your other watches that have an SW200 in it. Most of them will have a winding sound while you're threading the crown in. So I'm not sure why this watch does that, but my only other watch that I have that does do that for sure is my Oris Aquis. So that's definitely not a characteristic of the movement because I have lots of other watches with the SW200 in it. But the only watches that I have that have this, unique secondary pop out for the winding position are the Oris Aquis and the Glycine Combat Sub. So that's pretty unique there, and I like that feature because you're not going to overwind the movement. That could be a potential problem with Sellita SW200. I've never experienced anything like that with any of my watches, but I have heard of other people. So this would prevent overwinding of the movement because you're not getting any additional there. And I have checked this feature with the case back off. So the ratchet wheel is definitely not turning while you're screwing the crown in or anything like that. And I just think that's a really unique feature. And it's a feature that can be found on like some more expensive watches like the Oris Aquis. In fact, I think this watch stacks up pretty nicely against the Oris Aquis. They both have SW200s in them, sapphire crystals, and ceramic bezel inserts. Well, this one has a full ceramic bezel. So, and it's a lot more affordable as well. So this watch does stack up with some watches that are in a pretty higher price point when you compare it to this one. So all that goes in favor of this watch. Anyway, back to the crown and stuff. Other than that first position and when you're threading in the crown, it doesn't wind the movement. Everything else is standard. So once you do get in the winding position, that's winding. And then one click out is your date change. And then the last click is obviously hacking the movement so you can set the time. And then you just push the crown back in and again thread it in to lock in that 500 meters of water resistance. So while we're talking about crowns, let's go ahead and talk about the helium escape valve located at 8 o'clock. This is a manual helium escape valve, and I know that's a point of contention for a lot of people. Most people prefer a flush mounted automatic helium escape valve, but I actually don't mind this. I think it adds some character to the watch. Plus, it looks pretty cool, and it's located at 8 o'clock, so it's out of the way on your wrist, and it doesn't stick out, and it's not cumbersome or anything. Plus, I like to use it as a little kickstand sometimes, which I think is pretty cool. So uh, it really doesn't bother me, and I actually enjoy it being part of this watch, and it helps separate it from a lot of other divers on the market. But while we're talking about the helium escape valve, let's go ahead and talk about its function, why you need one, and what it's used for. Because I feel like it's kind of a point of confusion in the watch community. So some people think that you need to be able to open these underwater. And a lot of people think that because, when you're diving, you're obviously underwater. But you would never open one of these underwater. If you were saturation diving, you'd be inside a diving bell when you were decompressing. And that's a completely dry atmosphere, inside there. So you could open this up and you wouldn't be in water when you were decompressing. So I'll just go ahead and try to explain that to the best I can. I'm not a diver or anything like that, but I'll go ahead and give you a little rundown on it. So you don't need a helium escape valve for a watch to be 500 meters of water resistance or 300 meters or even 1,000, right? You could have a watch that's rated to 1,000 meters of water resistance, and as long as it can withstand that pressure at those depths, you could chuck the watch down off the side of a boat, send it to 1,000 meters, and bring it back up, no problem. It doesn't need the helium escape valve to have that depth rating, but it does need a helium escape valve to be ISO 6425 compliant, which this watch is ISO 6425 compliant, just meaning that it's suitable for saturation diving. So let's go ahead and talk about why you need to breathe helium and why you would be around helium in a pressurized diving bell in the first place. So at depth, the pressures increase, and oxygen and nitrogen, which are already in your bloodstream, act differently because they're what are called low soluble lipid gases. So under pressure, those become harder to respirate, and they can build up in your bloodstream. And so that nitrogen will make you kind of feel drunk, and plus oxygen isn't being respirated the same way it would at sea level or normal atmospheric pressure. And well, that's not good because then you could get CO2 built up in your blood, and we all know that's bad. So you could get carbon dioxide poisoning and stuff like that. So what they do is they mix in helium into the gases because helium is a low lipid solubility gas, and it makes those other gases easier to respirate and go through your system. And that obviously is good for a diver because it doesn't make you feel drunk. It helps with your orientation, and especially if you're in water with low visibility and stuff like that, it could be really dangerous if you were feeling drunk, you didn't even know which way was up or something like that, and you were diving. So they mix in helium to help those other two gases. So let's talk about the like a little diving chart here. I pulled it up. So the rule of thumb is that you need to decompress for an entire day for every 100 meters. And I know some people don't think 100 meters is even saturation level of diving, but it is. Even though most air divers are rated to 200 meters, even 100 meters can be considered saturation diving, depending on how long you were down there. So you can imagine if your decompression time is a whole entire day, you couldn't work very much. Actually, this table says here that you add a day on top of it, like right off the gate, it's a day, and then for every 100 meters, it's another day. So if you dove at 200 meters for one day, then you would need to decompress for 3 whole days. So you can imagine that people that employ saturation divers for underwater welding and other things like that, it'd be really inefficient to send somebody down to work for 1 hour, and then the rest of the time they would be decompressing for, the next day or two. So what they do is they send divers down in a diving bell, and this diving bell is pressurized to the same pressure as the outside, and it's also, you're breathing the same gases that you would breathe inside the diving bell that you would outside of it. So this enables them to send divers down, and they can work the regular 8-hour work shift, go back to the diving bell, sleep, and go out the next morning, and then they complete their whole work week. And at the end of that work week, they decompress one time, and they would decompress for an entire week or maybe longer. In some cases, 2 weeks. It would go off how long you were down there and what depth you were down there. So it's during this final decompression that you would use your helium escape valve. So while you were pressurized in that diving bell, obviously helium is a very small atom and it's pressurized, so that can slip into some of the gaskets. And the reason why water won't is because it's obviously a larger molecule, so it couldn't get into the watch, but sometimes the helium can. And during decompression, the helium can expand, and that's what could potentially blow out some of your gaskets or pop your crystal out when the change in pressure. So that's why you would need to use your helium escape valve only one time at the end of your dive while you're decompressing inside a diving bell, which is completely dry. So that's why you would need one. There are some watches like the Seiko Marine Master that have a monocoque case, and they don't have a case back gasket at all, so they're less likely to have helium ingress, so they don't need a helium escape valve. And there might be a few others, but the majority of watches utilize one for that purpose. And I hope that did a decent job of explaining it. So we'll move on from that. So the movement inside is a Sellita SW200. So this is a pretty well-known workhorse movement, and it does beat at 28,800 beats per hour or 8 ticks a second, giving it that smooth sweep to the seconds hand. This movement does have a 38-hour power reserve. Glycine does state here that is an elaborate grade version of the movement, so it is adjusted in 3 positions, and it does have a daily deviation acceptable of plus minus 7 seconds up to plus minus 20 seconds per day. But I do tend to find that these run a little bit better than that. Most of my combat subs run anywhere from plus 5 to plus 7 seconds a day. And this particular one is actually my best running watch of any watch that I own, because it actually gains 3 seconds per day when it's on wrist, and then I leave it on its side at night, propped up on that little kickstand or helium escape valve there, and it seems to lose 3 seconds a night. So this watch actually gains plus minus 0 even if I wear it for a whole week, and that's how I tend to wear my watches in rotation. So I wear them for about a week, and at the end of a week, this watch has gained or lost nothing. It runs bang on, so that's pretty exceptional. But I do suspect it's just this particular case, because some of my other combat subs, normally gain 5 seconds a day, and that's pretty normal. But still pretty good value. It's a really well-known movement, and they don't have too many problems. And if you do have a problem with your movement, you can get it easily serviced by your watchmaker for not a lot of money, and you can find most places to service that movement. So it does come on this really nice integrated strap. It is a true integrated strap. You can see from these pictures here, they actually milled out a little section in between the lugs there. And then there's a tab corresponding on the strap that sits inside that groove that they cut out there. And that just gives the strap some extra rigidity. And it just does make a more seamless kind of fit there. And you kind of really get the sense that the strap and the watch head were designed for one another. And although it is technically proprietary lug and strap design, because it was designed so well, I really couldn't see myself wearing it on anything else but this strap anyway. So though you don't get the variety of being able to change out different straps, it's such a good, excellent, clean execution, and it fits together so well. Like I said, I couldn't really imagine wearing this watch on anything else. You truly get the sense that this strap was designed to go with this watch. Um, so it is made out of Swiss made rubber. I don't know how well you can see that on the inside there. So, Swiss made rubber is clearly better than any other kind of rubber. No, I'm just kidding, but I really just think that this is, natural vulcanized rubber. But I do greatly appreciate that, and I do prefer it over silicone. It is a little thicker. It feels more durable. It doesn't get linty like silicone, and it doesn't break down like silicone does. So you kind of get the sense that this is going to hold up over time a lot better. Plus, if you look at it closely, especially in the light, it's got a little bit of metallic flake inside the rubber, and that's just a really cool touch there. They did sign it Glycine, and it does have these two bolstered little lines here to kind of break up some of the visual details there for the strap. So it does flare out here at the lugs to 22, and then it tapers down to 20 at the clasp. And the clasp is integrated into the strap as well. So it's a really clean, aesthetically pleasing design, not only to the eye, but it's also very comfortable. You do have to cut this strap to size it, but they give you plenty of score lines there, so you get pretty decent amount of adjustability, and you can really get the clasp centered really nicely and right in the center of the watch, and it's pretty easy to do. This clasp I did talk about a little bit in the beginning of the video, but I'll go over it again here. It really kind of just completes the package. It's a fully milled clasp. It's a dual trigger, push button release, fully milled swing arm there. And then you do get the dive extension. So you just slide back on these two little pushers here, and then you can engage or disengage your dive extension there. And it does ratchet back in, so it locks into place quite nicely. One thing I will say is that I thought that this clasp was kind of generic when I first got this watch. So I ordered a strap code version of it, and you can see here. And my thought process was I'll just chuck the strap code one on and kind of save my OEM clasp from getting all scratched up and stuff. But I was a little disappointed at first to see that the strap code won't fit. If you look at the ends of the Glycine clasp, both of them are even, and on the strap code clasp, one of them's a little shorter, and that's meant to go on a bracelet. If you try to do that on the strap, it doesn't go in far enough, so the strap kind of pops out of the strap code bracelet. So I was kind of glad to see that Glycine didn't just take a part off the shelf. They did customize it a little bit for their needs. And then really what kind of surprised me the most was that once I had both clasps in hand, you can't really see it in pictures too well, or get a good sense of it from looking at stock photos online or anything. But once you have them both in hand, you can clearly see that the clasp on the Glycine is finished a lot better. All of the edges are smooth and have been rounded, and even the pushers are a little more polished and just more cleanly executed. And although that doesn't make a huge difference visually, it does make a big difference in the long run when it comes to comfortability. So on the Glycine clasp, you don't get any hot spots or anything. I do have this strap code clasp on another bracelet on a different watch that I wear, and it's comfortable, but it is a little cumbersome, especially when you compare it to this Glycine clasp. I wear this watch all the time here, and I don't get any hot spots or anything. So I do appreciate that Glycine did take the time to finish this clasp better and customize it slightly for their needs to be worn on a rubber strap. So, like I said, the clasp kind of ties it all in and completes the package there. So, let's talk about the loom. We do have a dual application of both C1 and BGW9. And I do appreciate the dual application here. It does make it easier to time your dive, especially at night time, because you have that corresponding BGW9 for the loom pip and the minute hand. One thing I will say though is that the loom is kind of a disappointment. The C3 on all the hour markers doesn't really hold up too well. It holds up nicely on the minute hand and on the seconds hand, but on the hour markers, it fades away pretty fast, and that's kind of even more disappointing because this is an ISO 6425, compliant saturation diver. So, it's kind of a bummer because if you were in low vis water or something like that, you would need really good loom. But other than the loom, this watch really doesn't have any other negatives. It is a little thick, but again, it has that extra water resistance. And the price is right. So I'll get my little warranty card out here. I did get this watch. It was actually way back in 2018. So it's been a while. But back then you could get this watch for $350, and that is a crazy steal of a deal, especially when you stack it up against some of the other watches in that price point. Now you can find them on the secondary market. Unfortunately, they have been discontinued, so that's kind of a negative as well. But you can find them on the secondary market for about $600, and I'd say that $600 is a good price for this watch. I'd happily pay that. I'm actually looking for an orange version of it, and I'd happily pay anywhere from $600 to $800 for this watch. The other negative though is that you do have to make sure that the strap is either not cut, or that if somebody did use it, that it was sized for a bigger wrist than your wrist is. That way you can cut it to size your own wrist. One thing I will say is that you can find these straps available on glycinestrap.com sometimes. Most of the time they're out of stock, but you can get on a list for the strap. So if you are looking for one of these watches, I'd say, check with the seller and see what size wrist it's already been sized for, or make sure the strap hasn't been sized at all. And if it has been sized and it is too short for you, see if you can get one from glycinestrap.com, and just make sure that you check all those boxes before you go ahead and pull the trigger on buying one of these. But again, I do recommend one if you can find one for, that 600 or 550 price point. They're definitely worth it, and they're a lot more comfortable than what the specs say on a sheet. So if you have a 7-inch wrist and you're looking for one of these and you find the right one for the right kind of deal, I'd say definitely go for it. You'll be happy with the watch for sure. Other than that, guys, I'm going to go ahead and close out. If you stuck around this long, I appreciate you. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.